I'm now going to introduce you to two basic urban elements, the street and the square, or the piazza in Italian. What I want you to do is learn how to think about the street and the square conceptually, independently of your experience of streets and squares that you know in the place where you're from or places that you've visited. We want to think a little bit about how they were conceived in the past and understand how that either might be the same or different from how we conceive of streets and squares today. We tend to think that cities, when they're designed from scratch, are designed on a kind of a tabula rasa, which is Latin for a blank slate. And in many cases, cities are laid out that way, as if the ground is sort of neutral or somewhat irrelevant, like a blank piece of paper, and we impose our order on it. And that's very much how the Romans, the ancient Romans, founded their cities, their founded towns that were meant to replicate, in a way, Rome itself, the capital of the empire. An ancient Roman surveyor, or agrimensor, would lay out a Roman town by first locating the umbilicus. The umbilicus means the navel, and Rome itself, ancient Rome, had its own umbilicus, which was believed in ancient Rome to be the center of the world, not just the center of Rome, and it was located in the Roman Forum. So every time a Roman surveyor would have to found a new town, the first thing they would do was locate this umbilicus and begin the planning of the town from there. So we'll locate the umbilicus here in the middle of our tabula rasa. And from there, then, the Roman surveyor would lay out the primary streets, the main north, south, and east-west streets. Roman towns were typically organized according to the cardinal axes. The north-south street was called the cardo, and it began from the umbilicus and ran north and south. And the word cardo means hinge, because they believed it was the hinge, or the axis about which the sun turns. So the sun pivots or hinges about the axis of the cardo as it moves on its trajectory from east to west. Then from the cardo, the agrimensor or surveyor would lay out the east-west street, the decumanus. Sometimes in an ancient Roman city there might be more than one decumanus, the main east-west street, but it would be a kind of secondary decumanus. And then they would begin to lay out the secondary streets. Secondary in the sense that maybe they are not as wide as the primary street. Secondary things, less important things happen there. And they are part of, though, the fabric or texture of the pattern that makes up a classic Roman gridded city. And again, this is not unlike how modern gridded cities are effectively laid out, if maybe not organized about the axis of the sun. They are organized about some sort of abstract geometry. So that's the street system. And the streets in many ways come first. Then there is the piazza, or for the Romans, the forum. And forum really just means a place, like the Italian word piazza, the French place, or the Spanish plaza. And we would say, in English, we say squares, partly because in many 18th century English towns and squares, they really are square, or at least rectangular. And the Roman forum was typically rectangular or square. And the main forum for a Roman-founded town would almost naturally be at the center, somehow or another overlapping the cardo and decumanus, sometimes at the center, sometimes offset to one side or another. And in that forum, or around that forum, is where they would locate their primary public buildings. And those are the two essentially essential components of how cities were organized. The street, which is the primary conduit of people, and the forum, or the place of gathering, that is the primary kind of room, if you like, outdoor space of the city. So you have spaces for movement and places for arriving, or destinations, or places for gathering. And we tend to think this way, in many ways, that streets in towns come first, and then come the buildings. And so the buildings really fill in that space between the streets, and between the streets and the forum or plaza. And that's in fact how they were in fact built. The street comes first, the network of streets comes first, and then the buildings happen within or between the streets. What we're now going to look at or consider is how Rome in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance was transformed, and it was really transformed. It was an existing urban fabric that the Renaissance popes and their architects had inherited, and they transformed it by rethinking it, but they fundamentally had to deal with an existing matrix of stuff, and that's so different than this idea of the tabula rasa. And that's the next thing we're going to consider, is that Renaissance way of understanding the city.